So what I'm going to talk to you about today is Homer's Iliad, a poem that I've been reading and puzzling over really for most of my life, and which I never get tired of discussing, whether with undergraduates in general education courses or intermediate Greek students who are learning to read Homer in the original language, or the advanced graduate students in classics and archaeology, with whom I've just been on a spring break trip to the sort of field trip to the site of Troy in Turkey, where the events of the Iliad supposedly took place, to the combat veterans with whom I read the poem as part of a program at Penn entitled Eternal Soldier, through which we make ancient material on war and warriors available as a resource through which contemporary veterans can process their own experiences. And all of these different groups have very different perspectives on the poem's central themes, which include heroism, friendship, the search for meaning in the face of mortality, and the effects of war on individuals and on societies. So the Iliad is the work, it's usually thought of as initiating the Western literary tradition, although it's also now increasingly recognized that the Iliad incorporates many traditions of the ancient Near East, and in fact, that the sharp division between East and West, which begins to be asserted really in the ancient Greek world, is something of an artificial and an ideological construction. The Iliad came into being in the written form in which we know it around 3,000 years ago in the 700s BCE. But it was also shaped, and this is clear, by many centuries of previous oral poetry, and it incorporated many earlier poetic traditions. It's a kind of amalgam of historical memory and poetic traditions that span many centuries. As the cover of this particular translation of the Iliad, which is the one that I'll be quoting from today, as the cover of this translation, with its photo of the D-Day invasion, really brings home, the Iliad is centrally a poem about war. It tells the story of a brief but decisive period in the 10th year of the Trojan War, the legendary Trojan War, in which an army from Greece besieges the city of Troy, which is on the coast of what is now Turkey. And as you probably know, the cause of the war is the abduction of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, and the wife of the Greek chieftain Menelaus, who was abducted by the Trojan prince Paris. Although I think the Iliad is very clear that most people involved don't really care about Helen very much at all, and that like most wars, and this is something that I think the Iliad shows really brilliantly, this one has simply taken on a momentum of its own, where things that happen in the course of the war fuel its continuation. The climax of the Iliad's plot is the confrontation outside the walls of Troy between the best fighter of the Greeks, Achilles, and the best fighter of the Trojans, Hector, in which Achilles is victorious and Hector dies. The poem ends with Hector's death and funeral, but it's understood by all that the death of Hector essentially means that the defeat of Troy is now inevitable. And so the story of the war is effectively over. Much of this very long poem is dedicated to scenes of fighting on the battlefield, or else to scenes of deliberation and verbal sparring among aristocratic male warriors who repeatedly throw themselves into the front lines of battle in order to win glory, lasting fame that will outlive their short lives. And the Iliad presents itself as the vehicle for the preservation and transmission of this glory. That's the main thing the poem exists to do, to make fame won through death in battle into a form of immortality. So it's very much a poem about men and the challenges of meeting a highly militarized society's standards of male heroism, all in a conceptual universe in which war, while recognized as destructive and often dehumanizing, is also viewed as an inescapable, constant feature of human existence. But as I mentioned before, the Iliad also incorporates other poetic traditions, and those include the tradition of lament, a kind of poetry that was typically voiced by and was often composed by women. So this is where we connect to the themes of Women's History Month. This tradition of lament has deep roots in the poetry of the ancient Near East, and it includes lamentation both for dead leaders and for fallen cities. The Iliad draws on the language of lament to give a voice to the female figures who appear at the margins of its story. The captive women from neighboring cities who live in the Greek camp. The Greeks have been at Troy for 10 years by the time the events of the Iliad take place, and they've kept themselves going by raiding all the nearby cities of the region around Troy. So the captive women from these neighboring cities who live in the Greek camp, and the Trojan mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters who are cooped up inside the besieged city. These women's laments are a small part of the Iliad's overall narrative, but they provide a memorable complement to the accounts of illustrious warfare that dominate the poem, introducing a different and sometimes quite critical perspective into a poem that is focused on men's exploits as warriors. With its emphasis on loss and on the suffering of survivors, lament has an uneasy relationship with the glorification of death and battle, which is an essential feature of that warrior society. So in the poetic idiom of the Iliad, lament is the main mode of female self-expression. And we hear women using the language of lament, even in situations in which they are not strictly mourning the dead. Often they use it in attempts to influence the action of the plot and to motivate men in order to get them to do what these women would like them to do. And sometimes the desires of these women, quite often, are aligned with the military aims of the male characters. So just to give an example of this, at one point in the poem, we get the story of an angry, reluctant warrior who is fed up with his family and his community, who's refusing to fight, but who is finally persuaded to do so by his wife, who gets him to join the effort to defend his city. And she does this by evoking for him. Oh, I'm sorry. This was a picture I wanted to show you of lamenting women. These are some wonderful sculptures of lamenting women that are in the Getty Museum, and I wanted to show you those before turning to this passage, which is where this woman persuades her reluctant husband to join the effort to defend his city by evoking for him in advance the kinds of losses that generally form the subject of laments. Then his wife wailed and listed for him all the woes that befall a captured people, the men killed, the town itself burnt, the women and children led into slavery. This roused his spirit. He clapped on armor and went out to fight. So this wife gets her husband to do what she wants him to by fighting to save their city. So he and she remain fundamentally in sync here. But I think it's interesting that the future image, the image of the future that she uses to motivate him, with men killed and women enslaved, shows how the stakes of war are actually different for men and for women. And we can see how war, we can see how the Iliad shows us that war drives men and women apart in another more complicated and fully developed episode, in which the great Trojan hero Hector is entreated by his wife Andromache. Andromache also uses the language of lament, but this time unsuccessfully. And her objective is not to get her husband to fight in the first place, but rather to get him to fight more defensively, drawing back to the city walls in order to protect the city, rather than rushing out to the battlefield to fight in the front lines. So she's afraid that Hector's quest for glory will cause him to die out there and essentially abandon them. So she says, "Possessed is what you are, Hector. Your courage is going to kill you, and you have no feeling left for your little boy or for me, the luckless woman who will soon be your widow. It won't be long before the whole Greek army swarms and kills you. And when they do, it will be better for me to sink into the earth." Andromache then goes on to tell the history of her family, who were all killed when the Greeks destroyed her city in one of these raids I was mentioning. And then she ends her speech by imploring Hector, "But show some pity and stay here by the tower. Don't make your child an orphan, your wife a widow." But the grief that Andromache recalls from her captured city and the grief that she foresees if Hector dies are not sufficient to make Hector change his strategy, even though he is portrayed as deeply sympathetic to her, and that Hector is arguably the most sympathetic character in the Iliad. I think one of the greatest things about the Iliad is that its warrior heroes can be extraordinarily clear-eyed and articulate about the costs and the logical contradictions of the enterprise that they are, at the same time, completely committed to. So with great anguish, Hector explains to Andromache why he cannot do as she wishes. "Yes, Andromache, I worry about all this myself, but my shame before the Trojans and their wives with their long robes trailing would be too terrible if I hung back from battle like a coward, and my heart won't let me. I have learned to be one of the best, to fight in Troy's first ranks, defending my father's honor and my own." It seems to me that Hector is displaying a really startling degree of clarity here, as he spells out that he has been so deeply schooled in this heroic ethos of going all out and putting his life on the line for glory that he can't listen to her, even though it's clear that part of him would really like to. I think he's, that awareness that this ethic of kind of heroic valor that he's completely committed to is also something that he learned, that he was trained in, that was imposed on him by his society. It's sort of an amazing insight for a warrior like him to articulate. So Hector is really completely aware that he's responding to social pressure. And it's interesting to notice here also that the women of Troy are as much a source of that pressure as the men are. That they can sort of appear on both sides of the equation. So it's the Trojans and their wives that would make him feel shame if he did otherwise. And he's really, as I said, aware that he is responding to a kind of indoctrination. He then goes on to say that he knows that he's bound to die in battle, and he knows what that will mean for her, that she will be captured and subjected to truly humiliating enslavement. But he still can't escape. It's really interesting to see this. He really can't escape his own investment in a kind of unequal bargain where men win glory when they lose their lives, but women live on to suffer a fate that, as Andromache has said, is in many ways worse than death. So Hector imagines Andromache enslaved to some Greek, weaving cloth or carrying water, doing menial labor, and hearing, which, for someone who had been a queen in Troy, and hearing someone talk about her. And someone seeing you crying will say, that is the wife of Hector, the best of all the Trojans when they fought around Ilion. Someday, someone will say that, renewing your pain at having lost such a man to fight off the day of your enslavement. But may I be dead and the earth heaped up above me before I hear your cry as you are dragged away. I think there's something sort of surprisingly and disturbingly callous as well as poignant in this speech of Hector's. And it certainly speaks to the distance that war puts between men and women. So even as Andromache suffers in his vision, she'll also be the carrier of Hector's fame. And someone's going to look at her and say, oh, Hector was the best of all. And that's the thing that these warriors are really, they value the most, is because they know that they will not survive. They value their future reputation, and they're all fighting constantly to be considered the best. They're in a constant struggle to be labeled the best. So when he imagines her, she's sort of carrying forth his glory as the best of all the Trojans when they fought around Ilion. And then he kind of admits that her suffering is something he ultimately would just rather not know about. He'd rather be dead than to have to hear her cry. And since his fate in the poem plays out as he envisions it here, he never does have to hear that cry. The poem ends, as I suggested, with the death of Hector, and after he's been killed by Achilles, and Troy is therefore inevitably doomed. And the final episode of the poem describes Hector's funeral, and it includes formal laments by him, formal laments for him that are delivered by three women: his mother Hecuba, Helen, the Greek woman who's been in Troy all these years and speaks kind of touchingly about how Hector was a lot nicer to her than the other Trojans were. And then, of course, his wife Andromache. Now, for an expression of grief for someone deeply loved and missed, which it certainly is, Andromache's lament for Hector is strikingly critical and strikingly acute, I think, about the nature of warfare. It's not untypical for ancient laments to include expressions of anger at the dead person for having for having abandoned the lamenting survivor. And I think that's an experience, we can all understand, perverse as in some ways it may seem. Lament is really a form, therefore, that can incorporate criticism as well as praise of the dead, which is sort of what its more dominant and expected tenor. Andromache predicts that with Hector gone, the city will soon be captured, and that's certainly she's certainly right about that. and that she will therefore be carried away in the Greek ships along with the other Trojan women. And then she switches gears a little bit, and she turns from addressing Hector to addressing their son, Astyanax. She lays out two possible futures for Astyanax, although we know, listening to the poem, which one will be his future, which is the cruelest of the two, which is to be thrown to his death from the ramparts of Troy. And you, my son, you will either come with me and do menial labor for an ungentle master, or some Greek will lead you by the hand and throw you from the tower, a grievous death, angry because Hector killed his brother or his father or his son. Many, many Greeks fell in battle under Hector's hands. Your father was not gentle in grievous combat. So while voicing her grief, Andromache here is also, through her choice of language, offering an implicit analysis of why the violence of warfare is endless and self-perpetuating. As she explains his horrible fate to her son as a kind of fact of life, she stands herself outside the dynamic of proliferating male violence, of which she and he are both victims. Both of Astyanax's imagined fates are tied through verbal repetition to what his own father has done on the battlefield. And these verbal echoes are a feature also of the Greek original that this passage is translating. As a warrior, Hector participates in grievous combat that inexorably extends itself in the grievous death that may overtake Astyanax. And however sympathetic a character he may be, in combat, Hector is not gentle. And this harshness is reflected directly in the retaliation that might be visited on Astyanax for Hector's ungentle actions on the battlefield, and also less directly, but unmistakably, in the hostile cruelty of the ungentle master, whom Astyanax might alternatively serve, as will Andromache herself. So Andromache is the most prominent female character in the Iliad, and the one who most, sort of strikingly uses the language of lament, and the one who uses it, as I've suggested, to the most critical effect. But the poem also includes a memorable lament by another woman who is named Briseis. Briseis is a war prize who has been captured when Achilles destroyed the city where she had lived as the wife of its king, Mynes. Briseis now belongs to Achilles as essentially his sex slave. She plays an important role in the plot because she is fought over by Achilles and the Greek commander Agamemnon. And this conflict is what really initiates the particular plot of the Iliad, and it has far-reaching and serious repercussions for Achilles and for the Greek army. But despite her important role as the object of competition between these two leaders, we don't really get any sense of Briseis's own perspective on the action until fairly late in the poem, when, with the death of Achilles' close companion Patroclus, who was a much more gentle character than Achilles. At that point, the poet includes a brief 13-line lament that Briseis delivers over Patroclus's body. And this gives us a glimpse into that life of loss followed by enslavement that Andromache fears and Hector doesn't want to know about. I've seen my husband, the man my father and mother gave me to, mangled with sharp bronze before my city. And my 3 brothers, all from the same mother, brothers I loved, they all died that day. But you wouldn't let me cry. when Achilles killed my husband and destroyed Mine's city, wouldn't let me cry. You told me you'd make me Achilles' bride, told me you'd take me on a ship to Phthia. That's where Achilles is from, Phthia. To Phthia for a wedding among the Myrmidons. I will never stop grieving for you, forever sweet. This lament opens up for us a momentary window onto the horrific accommodations that a woman in Briseis' situation is forced to make. Here, it turns out her best hope is to become the official wife of the man who has killed her husband and brothers. As Briseis mourns, she's not alone, but rather she is surrounded by other captive women in Achilles' household, and their lamenting is also mentioned in a few short but haunting lines. Thus Briseis and the women mourned with her, for Patroclus, yes, but each woman also for her own troubles. This, as I've said, is not where the Iliad's attention mostly rests. The poem really is focused on what happens on the battlefield. But with these laments, it gestures towards the stories that it doesn't choose to tell. The story of Briseis, which is just briefly sketched in, and all the stories of those other women that it doesn't even specify, but that it does in this tiny way recognize as many particular sets of troubles that each of these women has to come to terms with. And this makes the Iliad, to my mind, a stronger poem. And it also makes it a starting point for other authors with other priorities who might be moved to fill in those untold stories. So I'll end by just noting that we are right now at a moment when a large number of contemporary women writers are going back to the Iliad and the Odyssey and to other works of classical literature and reimagining the female characters who are often at the margins of those earlier texts, making them the central characters, supplying their voices and telling their stories in detail. You may well have encountered some of these works already yourselves. Madeline Miller's Circe is a particularly popular and well-known example, which is based on one of the female characters of Homer's Odyssey. But I thought I would just mention a recent pair of novels by the British novelist Pat Barker that retell the story of the Iliad from the point of view of Briseis, fully imagining what life in the Greek camp would have been like for someone like her and the many other unnamed women who were there with her, and giving Briseis a thoughtful, observant, many-faceted voice that often has notes of bitterness in it, but is not confined just to lamentation. So thank you for listening. That's where what I've chosen to prepare ends, but I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments in the later session.